Let's start with this root today. In Latin, the verb necto means to nect. It means to bind. And you'll notice that the word bind actually occurred earlier on in the declaration, or was it bands or binds? Yeah, the binds, right? And so what you have is you have the Anglo-Saxon side of English, including bind, as well as band for that matter. And there you have a rubber band. And what is it other than something that ties one thing to another? It unifies two different things with each other by tying them together. So in this sense, bind and tie are pretty synonymous. Okay? And so necto in Latin means to do that. It means to bind, to tie together. Okay? And so, not surprisingly, there are several words in English that come from this root, but not that many. But they're very important ones. Okay? So you'll see there where it says L, that's the Latin, because it means that it's derived from Latin. And necto means I bind or I tie. Okay? Or I pretty much connect. We'll see that's one of the English words we come up with. And then nexus is the perfect passive participle. In other words, the passive form of it, the having been bound. So nexus means having been bound. So that's the passive. And as I told you guys more than once we bring the nex root into English, it might as well be nect, okay? Because you lose that passivity. And in other words, you lose the grammatical particularity of how the word meant what it did in the original language, i.e. Latin, and now it just takes on a new life once it moves on into English. And so it's more a matter of expanding the horizons of the root than it is paying attention to the original grammatical status that the word had in Latin. Okay, so when you talk about a band, people playing together, the idea here is that they're unified, and when they play together, they harmonize with each other. By playing music together, they are one. And without that being the case, it would be anarchy, right? It's kind of interesting to juxtapose a rubber band with a band, and you realize that, that's not a coincidence that they both share that word. And then you have this, whatever, person getting ready to what? To connect these two things, the chords. And so what is that? What is the con? That's the cum. That's the Latin meaning with or together. So it means to bind together, to connect two or more things, is to connect them, to bind them together. And don't forget, usually when I give you the definition of these roots, I draw from the Anglo-Saxon side, the Germanic side of our language. And so bind and band both come from the German side of things. Okay? There's literally a word, B-A-N-D, or B-U-N-D, Bund. For example, when you talk about a nation, you talk about a Bund in German. It means a band. So in effect, a musical band is a musical nation. It's a nation of people who come together and harmonize with each other musically. And a connection, pat yourself on the back for knowing how that works, because that's just nothing but I-O-N, meaning the state of, or being bound together. Being bound together is a connection. And so when you talk about an internet connection, what does it mean? Internet, okay, so internet, the network, inter, between, the network between a bunch of different people from all over the world coming together, connected, right? It just means bound together at a great distance from each other in a way that was probably not conceivable to most people before there was at least electricity harnessed in households, but even after that probably. I mean, some of the stuff we take for granted now when it comes to the connectivity of people all over the world is unbelievable. And you were pretty much born into it, so it's even more unbelievable to me probably in the sense that I went through the process of not having that, except maybe through TV, which is kind of a nice attempt at it, and then now with the internet it's a lot more crazy when it comes to how extensively everything is getting connected, for better or worse, right? All right, now I did a little tricky thing here, not so well, it's not like perfect or anything, but check it out. So when two people are disconnected from each other, that's kind of using the word metaphorically. They're disconnected, not in the sense that you disconnect two chords from each other after you connect them, but rather disconnected emotionally, right? Something like that. And then when you reconnect them. Wasn't that fancy? You like that? That took me 2 minutes to cut it in half, blah, blah, blah. So you're welcome. just for you guys. Okay, so to reconnect them is to make them feel like they're bonded again and everything's cool again. Okay, no surprises here. Granted, every once in a while we'll come across a root that's a little more obvious than other ones along the way of mastering the Declaration of Independence, all right? Now this is a cool word. So Google, at one point or another, they had a phone that was called the Nexus Y, because it connects you, right? So it's an extension of this idea of the internet. The internet, the net, an obvious metaphor, meaning everybody connected in a net, enmeshed in the same net. And so to connect them with each other via a nexus. Nexus is really a synonym for bound or bind or band. So when we say that, nect means to bind and then a binding, that's what a nexus is. So nothing more fancy than that. It just means a connection. It means a coming together. And now getting into depressing things. The most famous use of the word annex, maybe, in our culture is referring to the secret annex of Anne Frank in World War II when she and her family were hiding out. Most of us hopefully have read the Diary of Anne Frank in school or whatever, and so you may also know of a book that's a collection of her stories, and I admit I haven't read this. I read the Diary of Anne Frank, like most of us in here probably, but not this one. But anyway, it's called Tales from the Secret Annex. So we got the A-N, which is really A-D-Y, because the root next begins with an N, and so the D turns into an N. Get used to it, okay? So that's by far the prefix that is most malleable when it comes to that, most flexible when it comes to changing one form into another. So it's really adnex. It's much harder to say adnex than annex. And that's why it's changed into that. Okay, building joined to or associated with a main building, providing additional space or accommodations, and that is the secret annex there at the top of the house that Anne Frank and her family were hiding in. And that's why it's called that, because it's connected to the rest of the house. The idea of the annexation of various, what would eventually become new states of the Union, the Louisiana Purchase, just means the connecting to the states that already existed. Okay, so that's why, and you know how that works because of the ION suffix that we painstakingly learned along with all the others that we learned. Okay, so annexation, annex, and good enough for that. Okay, so we're good. It's not that difficult a root to come to terms with, not too much in the way of variation, but these are important words, and it's good to know where they come from. Now we go to the next one. A little more complex, a little more interesting, I think. And this is not sumo wrestling. This is not the same kind of sumo. Okay, so to sume or something, and actually this root is a little more complex than it shows here. There's an extension of it that I might include later on in the semester, EMPT, empt, such as preempt or something like that, or caveat emptor and things like that, that are kind of an extension of sume and sumt or sump, but we'll stick with just this for now. In Latin, sumo means to take, okay, to grab a hold of something. And sumpt with a T is the perfect passive participle, so the passive, so it means having been grabbed, having been taken. Okay, so I might as well have put that after sumo there, I just didn't. Okay, so sumo, sumptus would be the two forms of the Latin verb that we're dealing with. Okay, so let's check it out. So I find this kind of an interesting few words coming up. To presume something, I don't know how many of us knew this, is to suppose something with some probability or evidence. Okay, so when you presume something, the implication is that you have some probable basis for coming up with your presumption. Okay, whether it be a mathematical one, a statistical one, an experiential one, some kind of basis that you can argue is a good foundation for being able to presume what you presume, as opposed to another word that we'll get to. But before then, let's take a look at this adjective that comes from this verb, presumptuous. It's almost always used negatively, pejoratively, and it almost always means thinking that something is the case that you probably shouldn't think is the case. Now, wait a minute. If to presume is based on probability, then why the heck is the adjective, and by the way, is not always negative when you presume something, it may be or may not be, kind of neutral. Why then is the adjective that comes from it, and I'm not asking you, this is rhetorical because nobody knows the answer to this, there's this adjective that is almost always negatively used, and it means or implies that you shouldn't be presuming what you presume. You're quite presumptuous, aren't you? It means you presume something that you shouldn't presume. Okay, so this is a good example of how not only a root brought into English can change its grammatical or otherwise change something about it from one language to another. It's whether it's active or passive, grammatically, etc. But also within the same language, when you turn one word that is derived from a given root into another word, and in particular another kind of word, as in this case a verb to an adjective, sometimes, not always, usually not, but sometimes, the flavor of the word will change as well. Okay? It's very interesting when that happens. And so this is a good example of that. Okay? I presume that you love the Dodgers. Okay? Someone's wearing a Dodger hat and a Dodger, jersey and blah, blah, blah. I presume you love the Dodgers. Okay, that's a fair thing to assume. Whereas someone says, I think that you hate men, something offensive, if someone says something, and you go, man, that's presumptuous of you. What are you basing that on? You know what I'm saying? So you got that kind of different way of saying that something is probably the case, and based on what the person who is attacked would disagree with your basis for saying such a thing. Okay, it's just interesting to notice when these things happen. Now, what is that other, and it was a little more than 16 seconds, I admit, what's that other word that is often confused with presume? Very good. Assume, which again means add sume, okay, to take toward something. Now, what's going on there? This is a nice little thing from Grammarly. I'm not really familiar with the site, but I thank them for this. To suppose without reason or evidence. So assume is to it's to do what you do when you presume, but without the backing of anything probable as a basis for doing so. Now I'm going to pick on someone online who I don't even know, and I'm sure he performs a great service for the world based on what I've seen, but in this case, let's pick on him a little bit, and sorry that we're doing this, but it's just to prove a point that sometimes what appears to be the case isn't the case, okay? We all do it, so it's not anything that important, okay? And that is, I don't know who he is, if anybody does, whatever. I just ran across this, okay, because I just typed in assume, and he's teaching people etymology.
One thing we use in English to actually explain assume is, because it comes away, there is no connection with evidence.
Notice what he says. He says, away from evidence. Now we, being etymological masters already, know that assume doesn't mean absume, which is away from taking, but it means toward taking, right? We're taking toward, we're assuming something in the sense that we're going toward it incorrectly, okay? So as much as we can appreciate what he's trying to do, he's trying to provide a mnemonic device for us to remember that it means something wrong, something don't do, it's away, bad, don't do it. It helps us to know what it really means in order to be able to acknowledge that just because you're going toward something doesn't mean you should be going toward it, okay? So in the case of assume, it's adsume, going toward something you shouldn't because you're being presumptuous, if you will, okay? So, it's not, again, I haven't seen anything else this guy's done. I'm sure the rest of it is just fine. I just wanted to point that out to you guys. I don't know what the heck that is, but she's eating. She's having fun. She is consuming. Now get ready to be a little grossed out because this is what we're talking about. When you consume food, you're taking it what? With yourself. You're taking it with your body. You're becoming inseparable from it temporarily, aren't you? And so that's the idea behind consumption. That's where the idea of consumption starts out, like most things, with a concrete example, with the physical aspect of taking something in the outside world, something physical, and bringing it into you as part of yourself. Okay? That's what it means to consume, and that's what a consumer is, one who does that. And then you expand the meaning of these things. So I'm using that photo at the top right as a kind of segue into branching out from the more literal idea of consuming by eating to give you an idea of what we're talking about in a broader, more general sense in our society these days with respect to a phrase that kind of bugs me for some reason. You guys have your pet peeve phrases? The content that we consume. It always makes me a little, it's like, consuming, you know what I mean? I'm watching your video and you're telling me I'm consuming your, but that's the idea, how we consume content. And then don't worry about the specifics of this little chart there. It's just the idea is that we branch out into this idea of taking in information, taking in entertainment, whatever, and it's just an expansion of this idea of taking in food into our body, okay? Kind of nice. And they say you are what you eat, and so there's that extension of that idea of becoming what you eat. Good enough. All right, now this is a verb coming from sume in Latin, not surprisingly because you know all the prefixes, means to take again, to take up again, to begin again with something that you already began is the implication, okay? And from this word, resume, comes the French word, which is another way of saying the modern Latin word, resume, okay? A resume. What the heck is a resume? Taking back. What does it mean? It means that you're putting down on this page the aspects of your past that are most relevant for the job you're applying for those who might hire you to look back at, to say that is the person that we may or may not hire, and so we're looking back at their past, at their history, as implied by the very word highlights. So you have the highlights of this person's experience, and you're looking back. It's the resume, it's the taking back of who this person is, the grabbing details and facts that are relevant to whatever job they're applying for and letting them sway you as to whether or not to hire them. Kind of interesting, right? Now we get into a little bit of history. I don't know if you know this or not, and I don't know if you know how serious this idea of class warfare has been throughout the ages and what a big deal it was in the US for the founding fathers who had their own share of kind of an aristocratic attitude toward the masses, so let's not fool ourselves. But there was this idea that in England there was a much greater sense of the distinction of classes, upper and lower classes, to the extent to where in England, throughout its history, Elizabethan, Tudor age, etc., in France, time of Louis XIV and beyond, not as much after the French Revolution, but before it, you had actual laws. We're not just talking customs, but laws that prevented people in the lower classes from buying, especially clothes, but other things too that symbolized upper class stuff, but mainly clothes, that were out of their league, that were too expensive for who they really were, because of the need. And you look this up, you guys. I'm not making this up. It's hard to believe, okay? Because of the need to continue to perpetuate this belief that those who were in the lower classes were lower, in fact, than those who were in the upper classes. Look into it. This is one of the reasons, this is reason 2690 why history is so important, you guys. Important to know where these things come from. Okay, it goes all the way back, at least to ancient Greece and Rome. These ideas of distinction between the masses and the aristocrats. What does aristocrat mean? It means best, better and best. Okay, and then the Romans had their version, the boni, B-O-N-I. What does that mean? The good. The good people were the rich people and the people who were in power. Why? Because they were born into the right families and they had landed wealth. Okay, so sumptuary laws are laws that tell you that you can take certain things to yourself, and there are other things that it's illegal to do because it provides a wrong message for mainly children into thinking that those who don't have money and power have the right to act as though they do. Interesting stuff. Okay, now I told you that this sume root extends into the empt area that I didn't want to weigh you down with because there's too many words, such as example and various other things that come from that. But just know that what this is really focusing on is being able to buy certain things and not be able to buy other things. Now the question is, wait a minute, if they're in the lower classes and you disdain them so much because they don't have money, then what the hell do you have against them spending the money they don't have on the things that, you know what I'm saying? It's just very strange stuff, okay? But there it is. So there's a good example, maybe the best of the semester so far, of how one word can create a lot of history that's worth paying attention to. And then sumptuous is kind of an extension of that idea. It's just an adjective that means expensive looking, believe it or not. Do you know, did you know there's an English adjective that means expensive looking? It means lavish. It means putting on the appearance of being rich, and then by extension, if you look at history, being better. And I didn't say that. History said that. Crazy stuff.